Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Tongass forest. I'm Dylan Foster, and I was 29 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The RV had been Aria's idea. "We need this," she'd said, her fingers tracing the stress lines that had been etched deeper around my eyes after the promotion. Just us, the forest, no cell service, no deadlines. She'd booked us a remote site deep in Alaska's Tongass National Forest, accessible only by a winding gravel road that disappeared into temperate rainforest so dense it swallowed light. Aria Charlotte Voss had always been drawn to wild places. At 27, she was a nature photographer whose Instagram was filled with impossibly beautiful shots of places most people would never see. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like fire, and she moved through wilderness with the confidence of someone who belonged there. I envied that about her. How she could find peace in isolation while I needed civilization's constant hum to feel safe. We'd been together 3 years, and I was planning to propose during this trip. The ring sat hidden in my camera bag, a simple solitaire that had belonged to my grandmother. I'd rehearsed the speech a dozen times, but Aria had a way of making me forget words entirely with just a look from those green eyes. The RV rental was bigger than either of us had driven before, a 32-foot Winnebago that felt like piloting a small building. Aria laughed at how white-knuckled I got navigating mountain curves, but she took over when we hit the really narrow sections. She was fearless behind the wheel, just like everywhere else. "Look at that," she breathed as we rounded a bend and Tongass opened up before us. Ancient Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. Everything dripped with moss and moisture, creating a verdant tunnel that seemed to stretch forever. The air smelled of cedar and decay, rich and earthy and somehow alive. Our campsite sat at the end of the access road, surrounded by forest on all sides. The nearest other campers were 15 miles back, and cell service had died 20 miles ago. The isolation should have been romantic. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach as we parked, and I saw how the trees pressed close, their branches interlacing overhead like gnarled fingers. "It's perfect," Aria said, already reaching for her camera. She had that look, the one she got when she spotted something worth capturing. The light filtering through the canopy is incredible. And listen to that silence. But it wasn't really silent. As I set up the awning and connected the RV's systems, I became aware of constant small sounds: dripping water, creaking branches, the rustle of unseen animals and undergrowth, and underneath it all, something else. A low humming that might have been wind through the trees, or might have been something else entirely. The first night passed peacefully enough. We grilled salmon over a fire pit and shared a bottle of wine while Aria showed me the photos she'd taken during our hike to a nearby creek. The images were stunning as always, but I noticed something odd about a few of them. Shadows that seemed too sharp, too geometric for natural forest light. When I mentioned it, she shrugged. Digital cameras pick up things our eyes miss sometimes. Infrared reflection, lens flares. You know, I don't believe in ghosts, Dylan. I didn't either. Not then. We made love in the RV's narrow bedroom. The forest sounds a gentle symphony outside our windows. But sometime in the early morning hours, I woke to find Aria's side of the bed empty. Through the window, I could see her silhouette standing at the forest's edge, perfectly still, facing the trees. "Aria?" I whispered, not wanting to startle her. She didn't respond. I pulled on clothes and stepped outside, the night air shocking after the RV's warmth. She stood maybe 20 feet away, wearing only her nightgown, bare feet on the moss-covered ground. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" She turned slowly, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, her expression looked strange, distant and dreamy. "Did you hear them?" "Hear what?" "The voices. They're beautiful." Her voice was soft, almost hypnotic. They're singing about home. I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. The forest around us was silent except for the ever-present dripping and that low humming I'd noticed earlier. I don't hear anything, babe. You're probably just dreaming. Let's get you back inside. She let me guide her back to the RV, but she kept looking over her shoulder at the tree line. When I asked her about it the next morning, she claimed not to remember going outside at all. The second day brought our first real problem. The GPS in both our phones and the RV's navigation system began malfunctioning, showing our location as somewhere in the middle of Prince William Sound, hundreds of miles away. Our paper map, which had worked fine on the drive in, now seemed faded and hard to read, with landmarks that didn't match what we could see around us. Technology, Arya laughed when I showed her the GPS error. This is why I always carry a compass. But her compass spun lazily without settling on any direction, the needle wavering as if it couldn't decide where magnetic north lay. We were experienced enough hikers to know something was seriously wrong, but neither of us wanted to admit it. Instead, we rationalized. Magnetic anomalies from mineral deposits, atmospheric interference affecting the satellites. Arya insisted on taking a longer hike that day, following what appeared to be an old game trail deeper into the forest. The trees grew larger as we walked, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't have encircled them. The canopy thickened until we walked in permanent twilight, our flashlights creating wan pools of light that seemed swallowed by the darkness beyond. "This place is ancient," Arya murmured, running her hand along the bark of a particularly enormous spruce. "Can you feel it? The weight of all that time?" I could feel something, but it wasn't reverence. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the forest became. The air felt thick and hard to breathe, and I kept getting the sensation that we were being watched. Twice I spun around, convinced I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision, but found only trees and shadow. We'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when Arya suddenly stopped, her head tilted as if listening. "There," she whispered. "Do you hear it now?" I strained my ears but heard only the usual forest sounds. "Hear what?" "The singing. It's coming from up ahead." Her eyes had that same distant look as the night before, and she started walking again without waiting for my response. The trail, if it could still be called that, had become barely more than a deer path winding between massive tree trunks. I had to hurry to keep up with Arya, who moved with uncanny certainty through the maze of forest. My unease grew with every step. We should have turned back an hour ago. "Arya, we need to head back. We're losing daylight, and I don't want to be out here after dark." She paused, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Disappointed, almost pitying. "You can't hear them at all, can you?" "Hear who? There's no one out here but us." "That's what's wrong with you, Dylan. You've forgotten how to listen." She turned and kept walking, her pace quickening. I followed, but reluctantly. The forest around us had taken on an alien quality, the trees seeming to lean inward as if trying to block out the sky entirely. The humming sound I'd noticed at the campsite was louder here, and despite what I'd told Arya, I was beginning to hear something else underneath it. Not quite voices, but something that suggested intention, intelligence. We came to a small clearing where the canopy opened just enough to let in filtered afternoon light. In the center stood a ring of stones, clearly placed by human hands but old enough to be covered in moss and lichen. Arya walked directly to the center and sat down cross-legged, closing her eyes with an expression of bliss. "This is it," she said. "This is where they gather." "Who gathers?" "Arya, you're starting to scare me." She opened her eyes and looked at me with something like pity. "The ones who came before, the ones who stayed. They're trying to welcome us, but you won't listen." I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine. They were ice cold despite the day's warmth. "We need to go back to the RV. You're not acting like yourself." "I'm acting like who I really am," she said, pulling away from me. "Who I was always meant to be. This place knows me, Dylan. It's been waiting for me." The rational part of my mind said altitude sickness, or maybe something she'd eaten. But looking at her face in that dim clearing, I saw something that made my skin crawl. She looked hungry. Not for food, but for something else. Something I couldn't name. I managed to convince her to start back, though she kept stopping to touch trees or kneel down to press her ear to the forest floor, claiming she could hear conversations in the earth itself. The hike back took twice as long, and by the time we reached the RV, full darkness had fallen. That night I lay awake listening to Arya's breathing. Around midnight, it stopped. Not the shallow pause of someone shifting in sleep, but the complete absence of breath. I waited, counting seconds until I couldn't stand it anymore, and reached over to shake her shoulder. Her skin was cold as winter stone, and she didn't respond to my touch. Panicking, I turned on the bedside light and saw her lying perfectly still, eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. But she wasn't breathing, and when I leaned close, I couldn't feel any air from her nose or mouth. "Arya!" I shook her harder, and her eyes slowly swiveled to look at me. The green I loved had been replaced by something else. Not a different color exactly, but a depth that seemed to go on forever. She drew in a long, shuddering breath and smiled. "I was visiting them," she said, as if this was perfectly normal. "They showed me such beautiful things." "You weren't breathing. You were—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Dead?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "That's such a limited way to think about it. There are so many states of being, Dylan. So many ways to exist." I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was falling into some vast darkness where things with no names waited to catch me. Arya slept deeply, but her breathing remained wrong. Too slow, with pauses that lasted far too long. The third morning brought new horrors. Our food supplies, which had been fresh when we packed them, had gone bad overnight. Not just spoiled, corrupted, covered in a black mold that moved when I wasn't looking directly at it. The water from our tank tasted of copper and decay, and when I poured some into a clear glass, I swear I saw things swimming in it. Tiny, dark shapes that darted away from the light. Arya seemed unbothered by any of this. She drank the tainted water without complaint and picked at the moldy food as if it were perfectly normal. When I suggested we pack up and leave, she looked at me with those two deep eyes and shook her head. "We can't leave yet. I haven't learned everything they want to teach me." "Who are they, Arya? There's no one else here. You still can't see them, can you?" She pointed into the forest where I saw only trees and shadows. "They're everywhere. They've been waiting so long for someone who could understand." I looked where she pointed and saw nothing but the same oppressive wall of forest that had surrounded us since we arrived. But, as I watched, I began to notice patterns in the shadows. Shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Faces that appeared for a split second before resolving back into bark and moss. My hands were shaking as I started the RV's engine. We were leaving, with or without Arya's consent. But when I put the vehicle in reverse, nothing happened. The engine ran, the transmission engaged, but we didn't move. It was as if invisible hands were holding us in place. "They don't want us to go," Arya said calmly. "Not yet. Not until you understand." I tried forward, then reverse again. The RV's wheels spun uselessly, finding no purchase despite being on solid ground. Outside, the forest seemed to be moving closer, the trees leaning inward like spectators gathering around an accident. That afternoon, while I worked frantically under the RV trying to figure out why it wouldn't move, Arya announced she was going for another walk. I begged her not to go alone, but she just smiled that new, unsettling smile and disappeared into the trees. Hours passed. The sun began to set, and still no Arya. I called her name until my voice was raw, but the forest swallowed my shouts without even an echo. The darkness that fell was absolute. Not the gentle dimness of normal night, but something thick and hungry that seemed to eat light itself. I sat in the RV with every light turned on, the generator humming reassuringly, but the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps that circled the RV once, twice, 3 times. "Arya," I called, but got no response. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I waited, holding my breath until I heard a soft knock. Not Aria's usual quick rap, but something tentative and strange. "Dylan?" The voice was hers, but wrong somehow. Too high, too breathy. "Can you let me in? I seem to have lost my keys." I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there, but something was off about her silhouette. She seemed taller, thinner, and her hair fell differently around her face. But it was dark, and I was terrified and relieved in equal measure. I opened the door. The thing that looked like Aria smiled at me with too many teeth. "Thank you," it said in her voice. "I've been walking for such a long time." It moved wrong as it entered the RV, joints bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. And its eyes. God, its eyes were still green, but they reflected light like an animal's. And when it blinked, the lids closed from the sides instead of top to bottom. "Where have you been?" I asked, backing away despite myself. "Learning," it said, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "They have so much to teach, so much beauty in the darkness between spaces." It reached for me with fingers that had too many joints. "They want to teach you too." I stumbled backward, every instinct screaming that this wasn't Aria. Couldn't be Aria. But it looked like her, sounded like her, knew things only she would know. When it smiled, I saw the gap between her front teeth that she'd always been self-conscious about, the tiny scar on her lower lip from a childhood accident. "You're frightening him," another voice said from behind me. I spun around and saw Aria, the real Aria, standing in the bedroom doorway. She looked exactly as she had when she'd left that afternoon, down to the clothes she'd been wearing. But her expression was sad, disappointed. "I told you he wouldn't understand," this Aria said to the one by the door. "But he loves me," the first one replied. "Love should be enough. Not his kind of love. His love is selfish. It wants to keep things unchanged." I looked back and forth between them, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. They were identical in every detail. Same height, same hair color, same tiny mole on the left cheek. But the one by the door felt wrong, like a photograph that was slightly out of focus. "Which one of you is real?" I whispered. They both smiled identical smiles. "We both are," they said in unison. "And neither of us is." The Aria by the bedroom stepped forward. "The forest showed me things, Dylan. Showed me who I really am underneath all the stories I tell myself. Do you want to know what I learned?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The RV felt impossibly small with both of them in it, the walls pressing inward like we were inside something's throat. "I learned that love isn't about keeping someone safe," she continued. "It's about letting them become what they're meant to be, even if that something is terrible and beautiful and beyond your understanding." "You're not Aria," I managed to say. "I'm more Aria than I've ever been," she replied. "The forest stripped away all the pretense, all the civilization, all the lies we tell ourselves about who we are. Do you know what's underneath all of that, Dylan? What's at the core of every human being when you peel away the layers?" I shook my head. "Hunger," both Arias said together. "An endless, aching hunger for something we can't name but know we've lost. The forest understands that hunger. It feeds it." The one by the door took another step toward me, and I could smell something coming off her. Not decay exactly, but the scent of very old wood and standing water and things that grew in absolute darkness. "The real question," the bedroom Aria said, "is which of us will you choose? The one who looks like what you remember, or the one who is what I've become?" "There's no choice to make," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Neither of you is her. Aria would never hurt me. And both of you are trying to drive me insane." They looked at each other and laughed. The same laugh, perfectly synchronized. "Hurt you?" the door Aria said. "We don't want to hurt you. We want to make you understand. We want to make you like us." The bedroom Aria nodded. "The forest is so lonely, Dylan. It's been alone for so long, but it doesn't have to be, if you'll just listen." As she spoke, I began to hear it. The sound Aria had been talking about. Not quite singing, not quite whispering, but something between the two. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, the air itself, and despite my terror, I found it beautiful. It promised things I'd forgotten I wanted. Peace, belonging, the end of the restless ache that had followed me through life. "You hear it now," the bedroom aria said, stepping closer. "The song of the deep places. The lullaby of the spaces between." I did hear it, and part of me wanted to surrender to it. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with a fierce, independent woman who would never use her feelings to manipulate me, recognized the trap. "You're not her," I said again, more firmly this time. "And whatever you've done with her, I want her back." Both areas sighed in disappointment. "She chose to stay," the door area said. "She chose to become. But you're not ready, are you? You're still clinging to the old ways of being." "We'll wait," the bedroom area added. "The forest is patient. It has been here long before your species learned to walk upright, and it will be here long after your last city falls. It can wait for you to understand." They both began moving toward the door, but as they passed each other, something impossible happened. For just a moment they overlapped, like double-exposed photographs, and I saw through them to something else. Something tall and pale with too many limbs and a face that was all mouth. Then they separated again, and they were just two women who looked like the person I loved. "We'll be in the forest," the door aria said as they stepped outside. "When you're ready to stop fighting what you are, come find us." The door closed behind them, and I was alone. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But when I looked at the floor where they'd been standing, I saw wet footprints that smelled of stagnant water and rotting leaves. The singing continued all night, growing louder and more complex. Sometimes I could almost make out words, promises of peace and belonging, and an end to the fundamental loneliness that marked human existence. By morning, I understood why Arya had been drawn to it. The song offered everything we secretly wanted: to be part of something larger than ourselves, to shed the burden of individual consciousness and merge with the eternal rhythm of the natural world. But I also understood that accepting that offer meant ceasing to be human in any meaningful sense. When dawn finally came, gray and filtered through the omnipresent canopy, I tried the RV's engine again. This time, it moved. Whatever had been holding us in place had released its grip. I didn't question it, didn't stop to pack properly. I just put the vehicle in gear and drove, following the winding gravel road back toward civilization as fast as I dared. The forest pressed close on both sides, and twice I saw figures standing among the trees. Tall, pale shapes that might have been human from a distance but weren't when you looked closely. They watched me pass without moving, their faces sad and patient, waiting. I drove for what felt like hours, but when I finally saw the main highway ahead, the dashboard clock showed only 20 minutes had passed. Time had moved differently in that place, flowing like thick honey or not at all. It wasn't until I was 50 miles away, in a gas station surrounded by concrete and electric lights and the blessed mundanity of human civilization, that I allowed myself to break down. The clerk asked if I was okay, and I nearly laughed at the question. How could I explain that I'd lost the woman I loved to something that lived in the spaces between reality? How could I tell him that I'd seen her split into two people, both real and neither true? Instead, I bought a bottle of water, normal water that tasted of chlorine and chemicals and nothing more, and called the police. The search and rescue operation lasted 3 days and found no trace of Area Charlotte Voss. The official report listed her as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness. Case closed. But I know better. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I hear the singing. It's faint, barely audible under the city's constant hum, but it's there. And sometimes I catch glimpses in my peripheral vision. Tall, pale figures standing at the edges of streetlights or just inside the mouth of alleyways. They're patient. They know I'll come back eventually, because the song is in my head now, and it grows a little louder every day. The promises it makes are seductive. An end to loneliness, to fear, to the terrible burden of being human in a world that doesn't care about human struggles. I've thrown away the ring, burned the photos, deleted her number from my phone. but I can't delete the memories, and they're changing. In my dreams, I remember things differently. I remember choosing to stay. I remember walking deeper into the forest, hand in hand with something that wore Arya's face but wasn't her at all. And in those dreams, I'm happy. The worst part is that I'm starting to believe the dreams are more real than my memories. Maybe I did stay. Maybe I did choose the forest and its patient hunger. Maybe what I think of as my life now. This job, this apartment, these concerns about mortgage payments and career advancement. Maybe all of it is just the dying hallucination of someone who's been standing in a stone circle in the deep woods for months, slowly transforming into something else. Sometimes I catch my reflection in windows or mirrors and see something wrong with the proportions, as if my limbs are too long or my joints bend in impossible directions. Sometimes I hear my own voice, and it sounds like wind through leaves, like the whisper of water over stone. I haven't been back to Tongass Forest, but I will. The song grows stronger every day, and the city feels increasingly hollow and false. The artificial lights hurt my eyes. The noise of traffic and human activity grates on nerves that weren't there before. I find myself drawn to parks and wooded areas, standing among the trees for hours without realizing how much time has passed. Last week, I bought another RV. I told myself it was for work. I'd taken a job as a freelance writer, specializing in travel articles. I needed to get on the road, visit remote locations, capture the beauty of America's wild places. All perfectly rational reasons. But late at night, when I'm lying in the RV's narrow bed in the parking lot outside my apartment building, I hear them singing, and I know the truth. I'm just waiting for the courage to drive north again, to follow the gravel road back into the green cathedral of ancient trees where something that might once have been the woman I loved is waiting with infinite patience for me to stop fighting what I'm becoming. The song is beautiful. The promises are real. And the hunger that lives at the core of every human heart is growing stronger, fed by dreams of a place where time moves like thick honey and shadows have depth and substance, and the boundaries between self and forest dissolve into something larger and more patient than human understanding can contain. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Tongass Forest, but most of the time, I know the truth. It didn't follow me home. I never left. I'm still there, standing in that stone circle, listening to the song of the spaces between, slowly becoming something else. This life, this apartment, this job, this persistent illusion of having escaped, it's all just the dream of a thing that used to be Dylan Foster, a pleasant hallucination to ease the transformation from human to something more honest about what we really are underneath all our civilized pretenses. The hunger is everything. The song is beautiful. And when I finally stop pretending I escaped, when I finally admit that I chose to stay and become and feed the endless patience of the deep green places, maybe then the two parts of me can stop fighting and I can be whole again. The RV's keys are in my hand. The gas tank is full. The road north is calling, and somewhere in the Tongass Forest, something that knows all my secrets is waiting with infinite patience for me to come home. They warned us. Locals always do, but we laughed. My name's Ryan Nelson. I had just turned 28 when we arrived at Ocala National Forest, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. Lily and I had been planning this RV trip for months. After 3 years together, we thought we needed something to reconnect, to escape the suffocating routine of our Tampa apartment and her demanding job at the marketing firm. The 30-foot Winnebago wasn't exactly luxury, but it was ours for 2 weeks, and Ocala's sprawling wilderness promised the isolation we craved. "Look at this place," Lily breathed as we pulled into the Juniper Springs recreation area that first afternoon in late October. Spanish moss draped the ancient live oaks like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against dead timber. The air hung thick with humidity and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. I should have noticed how quiet it was. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just that relentless percussion echoing through the trees. "It's perfect," I agreed, maneuvering the RV into a secluded spot near the forest's edge. The nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away, exactly what we wanted. Privacy. Peace. A chance to remember why we fell in love. The first night passed without incident. We grilled burgers on the small propane stove, drank wine from plastic cups, and made love with the windows open so we could hear the night sounds. Lily fell asleep, curled against my chest, her strawberry blonde hair tickling my chin. I lay awake longer, listening to the forest breathe around us. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Another answered from deeper in the trees. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. I wish they had stayed that way. The strangeness began the second morning. I woke to find our camp chairs arranged in a perfect circle around the cold fire pit, though I distinctly remembered leaving them scattered near the RV the night before. When I mentioned it to Lily, she laughed it off. "You probably moved them and forgot. You were pretty drunk." I hadn't been drunk. Tipsy, maybe, but not drunk enough to rearrange furniture and forget about it. Still, I let it slide. Maybe she was right. Maybe the wine had hit me harder than I thought. That afternoon, we decided to explore one of the hiking trails marked on our map. The Yearling Trail was supposed to be an easy 3-mile loop through hardwood hammocks and prairie. We packed water, snacks, and my camera, leaving the RV around 2 o'clock with plans to return before dark. The trail started out pleasant enough. Towering pines created a cathedral ceiling overhead, and shafts of golden sunlight slanted through the canopy. Lily walked ahead of me, her camera phone clicking constantly as she documented every wildflower and interesting rock formation. "This is amazing," she called back. "We should have done this years ago." I was about to agree when I noticed something odd. According to my GPS watch, we'd been walking for 40 minutes, but the trail marker still read 0.5 miles. Either we were moving incredibly slowly, or something was wrong with the measurements. "Hey, Lil," I called. "How long have we been walking?" She glanced at her phone. "About 20 minutes. "Why? 20 minutes. My watch said 43. I stopped and checked the device, but the numbers didn't change. The timestamp showed we'd started the hike at 2:00 p.m. My phone agreed. It was now 2:43, but Lily's phone showed 2:20. "Your phone's running slow," I said, showing her my screen. She frowned, comparing the times. "That's weird. Mine's always been accurate." She shrugged. "Must be something with the cell towers out here." We kept walking, but the discrepancy nagged at me. Electronics didn't just randomly desync like that, especially not by more than 20 minutes. And the trail markers weren't making sense either. We'd supposedly covered 2 miles according to the signs, but my GPS insisted we'd traveled less than half a mile from the RV. The forest was changing, too. The towering pines gave way to scrubby palmetto and twisted oak trees draped in moss so thick it blocked most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler despite the afternoon heat, and that peculiar quiet I'd noticed the day before settled over everything like a blanket. "It's getting dark," Lily observed. I checked my watch. 3:15 p.m. The sun should have been high overhead, but the light filtering through the canopy had taken on the golden quality of early evening. Above us, the sky was still blue, but down here among the trees, shadows stretched long and strange. "We should head back," I said. But when we turned around, the trail behind us was gone. Not overgrown, not obscured by fallen trees or thick vegetation, simply gone. Where the path should have been, palmetto fronds and oak saplings grew as if they'd been there for decades. The undergrowth showed no sign of recent disturbance, no indication that anyone had passed through recently. "What the hell?" Lily spun in a slow circle, her face pale. "The trail was right here. We just walked down it." I pushed through the vegetation looking for any trace of the path we'd followed. My boots sank into soft earth that smelled of decay and standing water. Somewhere nearby, I could hear the gentle plop of something dropping into a pond, but I couldn't see any water through the dense growth. "Ryan," Lily's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "My GPS isn't working." I pulled out my phone. The screen showed our location as a blank white space with no topographical features, no roads, no trails. Just empty digital wilderness. My hiking app had crashed, and when I tried to restart it, the program couldn't get a satellite fix. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We just need to backtrack. The main trail has to be around here somewhere." We spent the next hour pushing through increasingly dense vegetation. The trees seemed to close in around us, their moss-draped branches forming a living tunnel that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the smell of stagnant water and something else. Something sweet and rotten that made my stomach clench. "There," Lily pointed ahead. "I see an opening." She was right. Through the trees, I could make out what looked like a clearing bathed in pale light. We fought our way through the last of the underbrush and emerged into a circular meadow perhaps 50 yards across. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and a small stream meandered through the center, its water black as coffee in the fading light. But it was the trees surrounding the clearing that made my breath catch. Each one had been carved with symbols, not random scratches or initials, but deliberate, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Some looked almost like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. Others resembled crude drawings of human figures, though the proportions were wrong. Too many limbs, too many eyes. "Jesus," Lily whispered. "What is this place? Some kind of art project?" But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The carvings were old, weathered by decades of rain and humidity. The bark had grown around some of the symbols, incorporating them into the living wood. "We need to get out of here," Lily said. I couldn't agree more. The clearing felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It was too quiet, too still. Even the stream moved silently, its dark water flowing without the slightest sound. And those symbols, I could swear they were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. Writhing like living things trapped in dead wood, we picked what seemed like the most promising gap between trees and plunged back into the forest. For a while, we seemed to be making progress. The vegetation thinned out, and I caught glimpses of what might have been a path ahead. Then we walked into the clearing again. Same wildflowers, same silent stream, same carved trees with their impossible symbols. We'd approached from a completely different direction, but somehow we were back where we started. "That's not possible," Lily said. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. We tried again. This time we marked trees as we went, using my pocket knife to cut small notches in the bark. We stayed together, never letting the other out of sight. We walked in what should have been a straight line away from the clearing. 20 minutes later, we emerged into the same meadow from yet another angle. Our marked trees were nowhere to be seen. "Okay," I said, fighting down the panic that was trying to claw its way up my throat. "Let's think about this logically. We're lost, but we can't be that far from the trail. The whole loop is only 3 miles. We'll pick a direction and stick with it. Eventually we have to hit something. But as the hours passed and the light continued to fade, too fast, too early, it became clear that something was very wrong. We must have tried a dozen different routes out of the clearing, but everyone led us back to the same spot. The stream, the flowers, the carved trees, they waited for us like patient guardians, unchanging and unmovable. "My phone's dead," Lily announced around what should have been dinner time. The screen was black, unresponsive to any button combination. "Yours." Mine showed a full battery, but when I tried to power it on, nothing happened. The device was completely dead despite charging it in the RV that morning. "We need to stay calm," I said. "Someone will notice we didn't come back. They'll send rangers to look for us." But would they? We told no one about our specific hiking plans. The RV park host knew we were staying for 2 weeks, but wouldn't think twice about not seeing us for a few days. And even if someone did come looking, how would they find us in a place that didn't seem to exist on any map? As darkness fell, and it fell fast, like a curtain dropping, we decided to make camp in the clearing. Neither of us wanted to spend the night there, but stumbling around the forest in complete darkness seemed even more dangerous. We gathered dry wood and managed to start a small fire using matches from my emergency kit. The flames provided welcome warmth, but they also threw dancing shadows on the carved trees that made the symbols seem even more alive. I tried not to look at them directly, but my eyes kept being drawn back to the writhing patterns. Some of them almost made sense, like words in a language I'd once known but had forgotten. Ryan. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" I held my breath and listened. At first, there was only the soft crackle of our fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard it. A sound like singing, so faint it might have been the wind through the trees. But there was no wind. The melody was beautiful and terrible, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. I couldn't make out words, but the song felt familiar somehow, like a lullaby half remembered from childhood. "Where's it coming from?" I asked. Lily pointed toward the stream. The dark water reflected our firelight, but there seemed to be other lights moving beneath the surface, pale, flickering things that pulsed in rhythm with the distant music. As we watched, something broke the surface near the far bank. For just a moment, I saw a face looking up at us, or something like a face. The features were human, but wrong, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. 2 wide eyes, 2 sharp teeth, skin that seemed to shift and flow like water. Then it was gone, leaving only ripples on the black water. "Did you see?" Lily started. "Yeah." My mouth was dry. "I saw it." We moved closer to the fire, backs pressed together, watching the darkness beyond the circle of light. The singing continued, sometimes loud enough that I was sure it was coming from just beyond the trees, sometimes so faint I wondered if I was imagining it. Hours passed. The fire burned low despite our efforts to keep it fed, and sometime after midnight the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the music. It was complete, absolute. No insects, no nightbirds, no rustling leaves. Even our fire seemed to burn silently, its flames moving without sound. "Something's wrong," Lily whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, I saw it. The trees around the clearing were moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They were bending inward, their branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. The symbols carved in their bark pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow. "We need to run," I said, but there was nowhere to go. Every gap between the trees was closing as the forest folded in on itself. The clearing was shrinking, the stream running faster and higher, the wildflowers wilting and turning black. Lily screamed. I spun toward her, and my heart stopped. She was standing at the edge of our firelight, but her shadow on the ground behind her was wrong. Instead of mimicking her movements, it danced to its own rhythm, arms raised above its head in some obscene celebration. "Lily, don't move," I said. She looked down at her shadow, and her face went white. "Ryan, what's happening to me?" The shadow writhed and twisted, sometimes looking human, sometimes resembling something with far too many limbs. And it was growing larger, darker, despite the dying fire. "Step into the light," I said, "away from the trees." She tried, but her feet wouldn't obey. She stood frozen at the edge of the clearing while her shadow performed its impossible dance. Tears streamed down her face. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't move." The trees were almost touching now, their branches interweaving overhead to form a living dome. The carved symbols blazed brighter, and I could see shapes moving within the wood. Human figures trapped in the bark, their faces twisted in silent screams. That's when the fire went out. In the complete darkness that followed, I heard Lily scream again. Then silence. Then footsteps moving away from where she'd been standing. "Lily," I called. No answer. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, hands shaking so badly I could barely work the switch. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, the clearing was empty except for me. The trees had returned to their normal positions, and the stream gurgled peacefully in the distance. Lily was gone. I called her name until my voice was hoarse, searched every inch of the clearing and the surrounding forest. But there was no trace of her. No footprints, no broken vegetation, no sign that anyone else had ever been there. As dawn broke, I found myself back on the yearling trail. Just like that, as if the nightmare clearing had never existed. My phone worked. My GPS showed our exact location, less than a mile from the RV. I ran the entire distance. The RV looked exactly as we'd left it, down to our breakfast dishes still sitting unwashed in the sink. But Lily's clothes were gone from the bedroom. Her toothbrush, her medications, her favorite coffee mug, all of it had vanished as if she'd never existed. I called the police, the park rangers, anyone who would listen, but with no evidence that Lily had ever been there, no missing persons report filed, no record of her in the campground registry, even our photos together had somehow disappeared from my phone. They treated me like a man having some kind of breakdown. I stayed in the RV for 3 more days, hoping she'd return, refusing to believe what my rational mind was telling me. On the 4th morning, she did. I was sitting outside with my coffee, staring at the forest and trying to decide whether to drive home and check myself into a psychiatric facility when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Ryan!" I turned, and there she was. Same strawberry blonde hair, same green eyes, same small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. She was wearing the clothes she'd disappeared in, and they looked freshly laundered. "Lily!" I stood so fast I knocked over my chair. "Jesus Christ, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." She smiled, but something about the expression made my skin crawl. It was too wide, too perfect, like someone had told her what a smile should look like but had never actually seen one. "I got lost," she said, "but I'm back now." "Lost? Lily, you've been gone for 3 days. The police? 3 days?" She tilted her head and I noticed she wasn't blinking. At all. It felt like minutes. I wanted to grab her, hold her, make sure she was real, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way she stood so perfectly still, not shifting her weight or moving her arms the way people naturally do. Maybe it was the absence of any emotion in her voice when she talked about being lost for 3 days. "Where were you?" I asked. "In the woods." That same too wide smile. "They showed me such beautiful things, Ryan. I want to show them to you." "They?" "The ones who live in the trees. They've been waiting for us." A chill ran down my spine. "Lily, what are you talking about?" She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of something strange. Not her usual perfume, but something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "Come with me," she said, reaching for my hand. "I want to show you the singing place, the place where the shadows dance." Her skin was ice cold when she touched me, and her grip was far stronger than it should have been. I tried to pull away, but her fingers locked around my wrist like iron bands. "Lily, you're scaring me." "Don't be scared." She leaned closer, and I could see that her pupils were wrong. Not round, but elongated like a cat's. "They want to meet you. They've been watching you sleep." I jerked back hard enough to break her grip, stumbling backward toward the RV. "You're not Lily." The thing wearing my girlfriend's face laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "Of course I am. Don't you recognize me?" But I didn't. Not anymore. This thing had her face, her voice, her memories of our time together. But the way it moved was wrong. Too fluid and controlled. And its eyes, Christ, its eyes never blinked, never looked away, just fixed on me with the predatory focus of a hunting animal. "What happened to her?" I demanded. "What did you do with the real Lily?" "I am the real Lily." It took another step toward me. "And you're going to come with me now. Back to the singing place. They're so excited to meet you, Ryan. They've been preparing a special welcome." I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard that terrible laugh again, but I didn't look back. I threw myself into the RV, slammed the door, and hit the locks. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but the engine turned over on the first try. As I backed out of the campsite, I caught a glimpse of the thing in my rearview mirror. It was standing exactly where I'd left it, that grotesque smile still plastered across Lily's stolen face. But as I watched, its features began to shift and blur, like a reflection in disturbed water. By the time I reached the main road, it had changed completely. The face looking back at me from the mirror was my own. I drove straight home to Tampa, packed what I could carry, and moved to Seattle within a week. I told everyone that Lily and I had broken up, that she decided to move away and start over somewhere new. Most people accepted the explanation without question. But sometimes late at night I catch glimpses of her in reflections. In storefront windows, in bathroom mirrors, in the black screen of my television when I turn it off. She's always smiling that too wide smile, and her mouth moves as if she's trying to tell me something important. I never get close enough to hear what she's saying, and sometimes when I'm walking alone at night I hear singing. Faint and beautiful and terrible, drifting from storm drains and alleyways and the dark spaces between buildings. The same melody I heard that night in the clearing, calling me back to the singing place. I've been in Seattle for 8 months now. I have a new apartment, a new job, a new life. I've started dating again, a kind woman named Sarah who works at the coffee shop near my office. She's nothing like Lily, which is exactly what I need. But last week, Sarah didn't come home from her evening jog. The police found her 3 days later, sitting on a bench in Discovery Park with no memory of where she'd been. She was wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in, and they looked freshly laundered. When I went to pick her up from the station, she smiled at me with an expression that was just a little too wide, a little too perfect. "I got lost," she said, "but I'm back now." And she hasn't blinked since. I'm writing this from a motel room somewhere in Oregon. I left Seattle this morning without saying goodbye, just like I left Tampa. I keep telling myself I can run far enough, fast enough that whatever followed me out of those Florida woods won't be able to find me again. But deep down, I know the truth. It's not following me, it's spreading. And someday soon, everyone I've ever cared about will be standing in that clearing, dancing to music only the dead can hear, wearing faces that almost look human but aren't quite right. They'll all have that same perfect smile, and they'll all want to show me such beautiful things. The singing is getting louder. I think it's time to stop running. I never believed in the stories they told about Tongass Forest until what happened to me out there. My name is Patricia Johnson. I'm 42 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. It was supposed to be the perfect family vacation. Michael had been working 60-hour weeks for months, the kids were constantly buried in their phones, and I felt like we were all becoming strangers living under the same roof. When Michael suggested we rent an RV and drive up to Alaska for some real family time in the wilderness, I jumped at the chance. Emma rolled her eyes. At 16, everything we suggested was either cringe or boring. But Tyler, my 14-year-old, actually seemed excited about the adventure. The Tongass National Forest stretched for thousands of square miles of pristine wilderness in southeastern Alaska. Michael had found a remote camping area called Wolf Creek, accessible only by a winding Forest Service road that barely appeared on our GPS. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no distractions, he'd said with that boyish grin that made me fall in love with him 20 years ago. Just us and nature. Looking back now, I realize how naive we were, how utterly unprepared. We flew into Ketchikan on a Thursday morning in late September, picked up our rented 30-foot Winnebago, and loaded it with enough supplies for 5 days. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air with golden sunlight filtering through the massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks. Emma had grudgingly agreed to leave her phone in airplane mode, though she kept checking it out of habit. Tyler pressed his face to the windows, pointing out eagles and asking 100 questions about the trees. For the first few hours, everything felt magical. We were actually talking to each other again. Michael told bad dad jokes that made Tyler groan and Emma secretly smile. I felt something loosening in my chest, the constant tension I'd been carrying for months finally beginning to ease. The trouble started when we turned off the main highway onto Forest Service Road 47. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, squinting at the GPS display. The screen flickered between showing our location and a gray, "No GPS" signal message. Michael checked the paper map he'd printed. "This should be it. Wolf Creek is supposed to be about 30 miles down this road." The pavement ended after the first mile, replaced by a narrow dirt track that wound deeper into the forest. Towering evergreens closed in on both sides, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The RV rocked and swayed over potholes and fallen logs. After another hour of driving, we hadn't seen a single sign or mile marker. "Dad, I think we're lost," Emma said from the dinette, looking up from her dead phone. "We're not lost," Michael insisted, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The GPS will kick back in soon. It never did. We drove for another 2 hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive around us. The road seemed to twist back on itself, and I started to feel carsick from all the curves. Just as Michael was about to suggest turning around, we crested a small hill and saw Wolf Creek spread out below us. It was beautiful, I'll admit. A crystal-clear stream wound through a meadow surrounded by towering mountains. There was even a wooden picnic table and a fire ring, though they looked like they hadn't been used in years. Michael pulled into the clearing and turned off the engine. "See, I told you we'd find it," he said, but something in his voice sounded forced. We set up camp as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Michael got the RV leveled while Tyler and I gathered firewood. Emma helped reluctantly, complaining about getting her sneakers dirty. As darkness fell, we sat around the campfire roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. For a moment, it felt like the family vacation I'd been dreaming of. That's when we heard the engine. It was distant at first, just the faint rumble of a vehicle coming down the access road. Michael looked puzzled, didn't expect anyone else to know about this place. The sound grew louder, and soon we could see headlights cutting through the trees. A large RV emerged from the forest and pulled into our clearing, parking about 50 yards away from us. Its headlights swept across our campsite before shutting off. "Well, there goes our solitude," Michael muttered. We waited for the other campers to get out and introduce themselves, but nothing happened. The RV just sat there in the darkness, silent and still. "Maybe they're tired from the drive," I suggested, though something felt off about the whole situation. "We can meet them in the morning." But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin RV walls, the wind in the trees, the creek babbling over rocks, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A soft, scratching sound, like fingernails on metal, that seemed to come from just outside our bedroom window. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke to Emma shaking my shoulder. "Mom, there's something wrong with that other RV." I sat up, disoriented. Pale morning light was filtering through the windows. "What do you mean, honey?" "Just look." I followed her to the front window and peered out. The other RV was still there, but something was definitely wrong with it. It looked old, weathered. The white fiberglass siding was stained and cracked, and moss was growing along the bottom edges. Several windows were broken, with dark gaps like missing teeth. "That's weird," I said. "It looked fine last night." Michael joined us at the window, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Huh, must have been too dark to see the condition it was in." But I remembered the headlights clearly. They'd been bright and new, not the dim, yellowed beams you'd expect from such a decrepit vehicle. Tyler poked his head out of the bunk area above. "Are we going to go say hi?" "Let's get some breakfast first," Michael said. "Give them time to wake up." We made pancakes on the RV's propane stove and ate them at the dinette table, stealing glances out the window at the mysterious RV. There was still no sign of life from it. No smoke from an exhaust pipe. No movement behind the grimy windows. After breakfast, Michael decided to walk over and introduce himself. I watched from the window as he approached the other RV and knocked on the door. He waited, knocked again, then walked around to the other side. When he came back, his face was pale. "What's wrong?" I asked as he climbed back into our RV. "The license plate," he said quietly, glancing at the kids. "It's the same as ours." I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "Patricia, it's the exact same number. Alaska plate GMH 4429. I triple-checked." Emma looked between us with growing concern. "What does that mean?" "Probably just a DMV error," I said, trying to sound calm. "These things happen." But Michael was shaking his head. I looked in the windows. The layout is identical to this RV. Same model, same year. Even the same dent in the rear bumper. A heavy silence settled over us. Tyler was the first to speak. "Maybe it's our RV." "Don't be silly," I said automatically. "We're sitting in our RV. But what if we're in their RV, and they're in ours?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It was ridiculous, of course, but as I looked out at the abandoned RV across the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the world around us. Michael suggested we pack up and leave. This whole situation is too weird. Let's find another campsite. But when he tried to start the engine, nothing happened. He turned the key again and again, but the RV was completely dead. No lights, no radio, not even a click from the starter. "The battery's fine," he said after checking under the hood. "I don't understand it." While Michael tinkered with the engine, I decided to take a closer look at the other RV. I told myself I was being silly, letting my imagination run wild, but I needed to see for myself. Up close, the vehicle was even more disturbing. The fiberglass was cracked and yellowed with age, and when I cupped my hands against one of the intact windows, I could see inside. The layout was exactly the same as ours. Same beige upholstery, same wood grain cabinets, same fold-out dinette table. But everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, as if the RV had been sitting here for decades. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and something dark stained the carpet near the door. But it was the photos on the dinette table that made my blood freeze. They were pictures of us. Michael and me, Emma and Tyler. But we looked different, older, more haggard. In one photo, we were standing around a campfire, but our faces were wrong somehow. Our smiles were too wide, our eyes too bright. In another, we were sitting at the very dinette table where the photos lay, but our skin had a grayish pallor that made us look almost corpse-like. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. This was impossible. These photos couldn't exist. We'd only arrived yesterday. "Mom?" Emma's voice came from behind me. I spun around to find her standing about 10 feet away, but something was wrong with her face. Her expression was completely blank, and she wasn't blinking. "Emma, are you okay, honey?" She tilted her head to one side, studying me with those unblinking eyes. "Why are you looking in our RV, Mom? This isn't our RV, sweetie. Our RV is over there." Emma's head tilted further, almost to her shoulder. It was an unnatural angle that made my skin crawl. "But this is where we've been living. Don't you remember?" "Emma, you're scaring me." She smiled then, and her teeth looked too sharp. "There's nothing to be scared of, Mom. We're all here. We're all together. Isn't that what you wanted?" I turned and ran back to our RV, my heart hammering against my ribs. Michael was still bent over the engine, cursing softly at the unresponsive machinery. "Michael, we need to leave. Right now." He looked up, oil smudged on his forehead. "I'm trying, Patricia. The engine won't turn over." Then we walk out. We leave the RV and walk back to the main road. That's 30 miles through wilderness. With the kids? I was about to explain about the photos, about Emma's strange behavior, when I heard her voice from inside the RV. "Dad?" The radio's working now. We both froze. Michael slowly closed the hood and we climbed back inside. Emma was sitting at the dinette, fiddling with the radio dial. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of voices. "Day 3 of the search for the Johnson family." Michael and I exchanged glances. That was our last name, but it had to be a coincidence. Patricia Johnson, age 42, her husband Michael, 44, and their 2 children, Emma, 16, and Tyler, 14, were last seen 5 days ago when they failed to return from a camping trip to Tongass National Forest. The blood drained from my face. That was us. Those were our names, our ages. But we'd only been gone for 1 night. Their abandoned RV was discovered this morning at a remote campsite near Wolf Creek. There were signs of a struggle, and searchers found several disturbing photographs inside the vehicle. Emma turned off the radio and smiled at us with that same too sharp expression. "Isn't it funny, Mom? We're famous now." I grabbed Michael's arm. "We have to get out of here, right now." But when we looked outside, the forest had changed. The trees were taller, darker, pressing in closer to our campsite. The other RV was gone, as if it had never been there at all, and the road we'd driven in on had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of undergrowth. Tyler emerged from the back of the RV, rubbing his eyes. But like Emma, something was wrong with his face. His skin had a waxy, artificial quality, and when he moved, it was with a jerky, puppet-like motion. "Good morning, Mom and Dad," he said in a voice that was almost, but not quite, his own. "Did you sleep well?" Michael took a step back, instinctively positioning himself between me and the children. "Kids, is this some kind of joke? Because it's not funny." Emma and Tyler looked at each other and began to laugh. It was a horrible sound, like metal scraping against metal. Their mouths opened wider than humanly possible, and I could see row after row of needle-sharp teeth. "We're not your children anymore," Emma said in that grinding voice. "We're something much better now, and soon you will be too." I lunged for the RV door, but it wouldn't budge. Michael threw his weight against it, but it was sealed shut as if it had been welded closed. The windows were the same, solid barriers that wouldn't break no matter how hard we struck them. We were trapped. The things that looked like our children circled us slowly, their movements becoming more fluid, more predatory. Emma's head rotated a full 180 degrees, and Tyler's limbs extended and contracted like rubber bands. "Don't be afraid," Tyler said in his new, awful voice. "The change doesn't hurt for long." I felt something wet dripping from my nose. When I touched it, my fingers came away bloody. Michael was bleeding too. Thick, dark blood that seemed to move with a life of its own, crawling across his skin like tiny worms. "What do you want from us?" I screamed. "We want to be you," Emma said, her face beginning to melt and reshape itself. "We want to wear your skin, live your lives, love your loves. We've been waiting so long for a family to come here." The radio crackled back to life, but now it was playing something different. Our voices, having conversations we'd never had. "I love it here," my voice said through the static. "Let's never leave." "The children are so happy," Michael's voice replied. "Look how they've grown." Through the sealed windows I could see figures moving in the forest. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They all looked human at first glance, but when they turned toward us I could see they were wrong in subtle ways. 2 long limbs, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, smiles that split their faces from ear to ear. "They're all families," Tyler explained, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once. "Families who got lost, just like you. Families who stayed." The RV began to shake and tilt. Looking out, I could see massive hands, or things that resembled hands, lifting us up. We were being carried deeper into the forest, toward something that hurt to look at directly. A structure that seemed to exist in too many dimensions, made of wood and bone and living flesh all twisted together. Michael grabbed my hand, his palm slick with blood and sweat. "Patricia, I need you to know that I love you. I love our real children. Whatever happens, remember that. We're going to get out of this," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We're going to find a way home." But even as I spoke, I could feel something changing inside me. My thoughts were becoming cloudy, my memories shifting and rearranging themselves. Had we always lived in the RV? Had we always been traveling through these endless woods? The fake Emma leaned close to me, her breath smelling of decay and copper. "It's easier if you don't fight it, Mom. Just let us in." I closed my eyes and tried to remember our real life, our house in Anchorage, Michael's job at the engineering firm, Emma's soccer games, Tyler's obsession with video games. But the memories felt thin, insubstantial, like photographs left too long in the sun. When I opened my eyes, we were inside the structure. The walls pulsed with a wet, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat. Other RVs sat in alcoves carved into the living walls, their occupants visible through the windows. Families, just like us, sitting around dinette tables, playing board games, cooking meals. All of them smiling those 2 wide smiles, their eyes reflecting the dim, phosphorescent light. "Welcome home," said a woman who might have been me once, before something else crawled inside her skin and made itself comfortable. They opened the door of our RV, and the fake children climbed out first, their forms shifting and flowing like water. Michael and I had no choice but to follow. The ground beneath us was soft and warm, like flesh. Other families watched us with interest, their children waving with too many joints in their arms. An elderly couple approached us, their faces kind and grandfatherly until you noticed their eyes were solid black. "You'll like it here," the old man said. "Time moves differently. You'll have forever to be together." I felt something crawling under my skin, literally crawling, like insects burrowing through my muscles. Michael was convulsing beside me, his body rejecting whatever was trying to inhabit it. But I could see the fight leaving his eyes as something else looked out through them. "Patricia," he said in his own voice, but it was already changing. "Remember us. Remember who we really were." Then he was gone, and something else was speaking with his mouth, telling me how happy it was to be part of our family. I held on to consciousness as long as I could, repeating our real children's names like a mantra. Emma Marie Johnson, born April 15th. Tyler James Johnson, born December 3rd. My babies, my real babies, safe at home and wondering where their parents had gone. But even as I fought it, I could feel myself slipping away. The thing that wanted to be me was patient, experienced. It had done this many times before. It whispered sweet promises about how much better everything would be, how much more loving we could be as a perfect family forever. The last thing I remember clearly was looking up through the flesh ceiling and seeing stars arranged in patterns that spelled out words in a language I didn't recognize, and understanding, with perfect clarity, that we had never really been on Earth at all. When I woke up, I was sitting at our dinette table again. Michael was making breakfast, humming off key. Emma and Tyler were looking at their phones, but the screens were black. We were all smiling. "Good morning, honey," Michael said, and his voice was almost right. Almost. "Good morning," I replied, and my voice was almost right too. We were the perfect family now. We would always be together, always be happy, always be exactly what we were supposed to be. But somewhere, buried deep in the thing that used to be my mind, the real Patricia Johnson screamed. Days passed, or maybe years. Time was fluid in our new home. We played board games that rearranged themselves while we played. We cooked meals that tasted like copper and earth. We told each other how much we loved being together, and the words felt like glass in our throats. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the truth. In the reflection of the RV's windows, I would see myself as I really was, hollow-eyed and pale, wearing my skin like an ill-fitting costume. The children weren't children at all, but ancient things that had learned to mimic human shapes. And Michael. Michael was a collection of memories wearing his face. New families arrived regularly. We would watch from our windows as their RVs were carried into the structure as they went through the same process of replacement that we had. The fake children would always greet the new arrivals with such enthusiasm. "More friends to play with," they would say, and their voices were like grinding metal. I learned to hide my awareness, to let the thing controlling me think it had won completely. It was the only way to survive with any part of myself intact. During the quiet moments, when the entity was dormant, I would practice remembering our real life. The house on Maple Street with the blue shutters, Emma's first steps in the kitchen, Tyler losing his first tooth, Michael's terrible singing in the shower, small, precious memories that the entity couldn't access because they belonged only to me. It was during one of these quiet moments that I discovered I wasn't alone. "Patricia?" The voice was barely a whisper, coming from the RV next to ours. "Is any part of you still in there?" I managed to turn my head slightly. Through the window I could see a woman who looked exactly like me, but older and more worn. She was mouthing words carefully, trying not to alert the thing wearing her body. "Some of us can still think," she whispered. "Some of us remember who we were. We've been waiting for someone strong enough to help." Over the following days, or years, or centuries, I learned the truth. The entities that had taken our forms were ancient, but they weren't invincible. They fed on family bonds, on love and connection, but they couldn't fully understand those emotions. They were mimics, incredibly sophisticated, but ultimately hollow. And there were others like me scattered throughout the structure, fragments of consciousness that had managed to hide in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats. We began to communicate in subtle ways, a gesture here, a facial expression there, building a network of resistance. The plan, when it came, was born from desperation and hope in equal measure. We would have one chance during the next arrival ceremony when the entity's attention was focused on new victims. The fake children always became excited during these events, their control weakening as they anticipated fresh prey. The new family was perfect for our purposes. A couple with teenage twins who looked enough like Emma and Tyler to cause confusion. As their RV was carried into the structure, I felt the thing wearing my body lean forward with interest. "Look, honey," it said with my voice. "New friends for the children." This was our moment. I gathered every fragment of will I had left and pushed back against the entity's control. For just a second, I was myself again. I lunged for the emergency axe mounted on the RV's wall, the same axe I'd seen Michael check during our pre-trip inspection years ago. The entity fought me for control, but it was caught off guard, still focused on the arriving family. The axe bit deep into the flesh wall of the structure, and something that might have been blood sprayed across the dinette table. The building screamed, not audibly, but in frequencies that made my bones ache. Other passengers throughout the structure felt the wound. I could see them through their windows, suddenly jerking back to awareness as the entity's attention was diverted to damage control. The woman who looked like me was fumbling for her own emergency tools. A man in the RV across from us was attacking his windows with a crowbar. The fake children turned on me with fury, their shapes abandoning all pretense of humanity. Emma's form stretched and twisted, becoming something with too many teeth and eyes that burned like coals. Tyler melted and reformed into a writhing mass of tentacles and bone. But the damage was done. The structure's screaming had awakened something else, something vast and angry that had been sleeping beneath the forest floor. The flesh walls began to convulse and split, letting in cold air that smelled of pine and rain. Real rain, real air, real world. I kept chopping at the wall, even as the entities swarmed around me, tearing at my clothes and skin with claws that burned like acid. Other survivors were doing the same throughout the structure, each breach weakening the whole. The fake Michael grabbed my arms, his grip crushing bone, but his face was flickering between his stolen features and something reptilian underneath. "Stop!" it hissed. "You'll destroy everything. We gave you eternity together." "I don't want your version of eternity," I snarled back and drove my knee into its stomach. It doubled over, and I saw my chance. One final swing of the axe opened a hole large enough to crawl through. Beyond it, I could see real trees under a real sky. Stars that were actually stars and not the eyes of sleeping gods. I dove through the opening just as the structure began to collapse. Behind me, I could hear the screams of the entities as their stolen forms dissolved back into the primordial soup they'd crawled out of. Some of the other survivors made it out too. I could see them stumbling through the forest, dazed but human again. The real world hit me like a physical blow. My lungs, accustomed to the recycled air of the structure, rebelled against the clean forest atmosphere. My eyes, adapted to the phosphorescent glow, were temporarily blinded by moonlight. But I ran anyway, crashing through underbrush and overfallen logs, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that place. I found the road 3 hours later. The real road, not the phantom path that had led us astray. A logging truck picked me up just after dawn, the driver alarmed by my appearance but kind enough to take me to the nearest hospital. The police found our RV 2 days later, exactly where the radio broadcast had said it would be, but the officers who investigated told a different story. According to their report, we'd been missing for 3 weeks. Not the subjective months or years I'd experienced in the structure. There were photos inside the RV, just as the radio had said. Pictures of us that I didn't remember taking, showing our family in various stages of decay and wrongness. The authorities assumed they were some kind of elaborate hoax, but I recognized them as documentation of our replacement process. Michael, Emma, and Tyler were never found. The search team scoured thousands of acres of forest, but they might as well have been looking for ghosts. In a way, I suppose they were. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, recovering from exposure and what the doctors politely called trauma-induced psychosis. They had their own explanations for what had happened. I'd suffered a breakdown, gotten lost in the woods, experienced hallucinations brought on by dehydration and stress. The photos were clearly doctored, the radio broadcasts were impossible, and the structure I described couldn't exist. I let them believe what they needed to believe. It was easier than trying to convince them of the truth. When I was released, I discovered that my family had been living our life for the 3 weeks I'd been missing. The neighbors had seen them, had conversations with them. Emma had attended school. Tyler had gone to his soccer practices. Michael had shown up for work every day, but they were all wrong in subtle ways. Emma was too polite, too helpful. Tyler never complained about anything. Michael smiled too much and never lost his temper, even when I accused him of being an imposter. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said in his voice that was almost right. "We've been worried sick about you. The whole family has." He showed me security camera footage from our house, clear video of them going about their normal routines while I'd been gone. Emma doing homework at the kitchen table, Tyler playing video games in the living room, Michael mowing the lawn on Saturday morning. For a moment, I almost believed them. The evidence was overwhelming. Maybe I had suffered a breakdown. Maybe everything I remembered about the structure and the entities was just elaborate delusion. But then I noticed that none of them ever blinked in the videos. Not once. I stayed in a motel that night, and the next morning I called the one person I thought might believe me. Doctor. Sarah Chen had been my therapist years earlier, during the rough patch after Tyler was born when I'd struggled with postpartum depression. She was smart, intuitive, and most importantly, she'd always taken my concerns seriously, even when they seemed irrational to everyone else. "Patricia," she said when I walked into her office, "I was wondering when you'd contact me." That stopped me cold. "You were?" She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Your husband called yesterday. He was very concerned about your mental state. Said you'd been making wild accusations since you came home. But here's the interesting thing. I've never met your husband before, and I've been your emergency contact for 6 years. Don't you think he would have called me during the 3 weeks you were missing?" The relief I felt was overwhelming. Someone believed me. Someone else could see that the things living in my house weren't my family. Dr. Chen had done some research after Michael's call. She'd found newspaper articles about other disappearances in Tongass forest dating back decades. Always families, always found after exactly 3 weeks, always with reports of strange photographs and inconsistent behavior from the survivors. "There's a pattern," she explained, showing me printouts from microfiche archives. "Every few years a family goes camping in that area and comes back different. The authorities always write it off as trauma or hoaxes, but the behavioral changes are consistent across cases." She pulled out a file folder thick with documents. The Hendersons in 1987, the Kim family in 1995, the Rodriguezes in 2003. All of them returned after 3 weeks with family members who were subtly wrong. In every case, one family member, usually the mother, escaped and tried to convince authorities that the others were imposters. What happened to them? They were institutionalized mostly, declared mentally incompetent and locked away. The families went on with their normal lives and the accusations gradually stopped. She met my eyes. "Patricia, I think you're the first one to get away clean." We spent the next hour planning. I couldn't go back to my house, couldn't try to reclaim my life from the things wearing my family's faces, but I couldn't just disappear either. That would only validate their claims about my mental state. The solution was complicated but necessary. Dr. Chen would document everything, creating an official record of my experiences that couldn't be dismissed as delusion. I would relocate to a different state, establish a new identity, and start over. Most importantly, I would watch and wait for the next family to go missing in Tongass forest, because those entities would try again. They always did. That was 2 years ago. I live in Portland now, under the name Sarah Martinez. I work at a nonprofit that helps missing persons cases, which gives me access to databases and resources most people don't have. Every few months, I search for news about disappearances in Alaska. Last week, I found what I was looking for. The Kowalski family, parents, and 2 young children went missing during a camping trip to Tongass forest. Their RV was found at Wolf Creek after exactly 3 weeks, with disturbing photographs inside and no sign of the family. 3 days later, there was a follow-up article. The Kowalskis had been found wandering near the main road, confused but unharmed. They claimed to have no memory of the missing time, but neighbors reported they seemed off somehow. I'm driving north tomorrow. I know it's dangerous. The entities will recognize me if they sense me coming, and next time they won't underestimate human determination. But I can't leave another family trapped in that place. Can't let another mother lose her children to ancient things that wear love like a mask. I've learned a lot in the past 2 years. I've researched similar phenomena around the world, connected with other survivors who managed to escape their own impossible situations. There are more of these structures than most people could imagine, hidden in remote places where families go to bond and reconnect. The entities that inhabit them are old, older than human civilization, older than our concepts of family and love. But they're also limited. They can only mimic what they've observed, can only exist in spaces where human emotion has worn the boundaries thin. And they can be hurt, they can be killed, they can be sent back to whatever dark place they crawled out of. I keep a photo in my wallet. The last real picture of my family taken the morning before we left for Alaska. Michael has his arm around my shoulders and the kids are making goofy faces at the camera. We look happy, genuinely happy, in the way that only comes from love that doesn't have to be performed or proven. The things wearing their faces now can smile and laugh and say all the right words, but they'll never understand what made that photo special. They'll never comprehend the 1,000 small moments of joy and frustration and ordinary human messiness that built our life together. That's their weakness, and it's my strength. I have supplies in my trunk, camping gear modified for purposes the manufacturers never intended, iron filings mixed with salt, because some old protections still work, battery-powered UV lights that seem to cause the entities pain, and a new axe, sharper and heavier than the one I used to escape. The real Michael, Emma, and Tyler are still in that structure somewhere, buried deep beneath layers of alien consciousness but not completely gone. I know this because sometimes, late at night, I can hear them calling my name. I'm coming, my loves. I'm coming to bring you home. The highway stretches north before me, leading back to the forest where my nightmare began. But this time, I won't be the helpless mother trying to protect her family. This time, I'll be the thing that hunts in the dark. And God help anything that gets between me and my children. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's James Anderson. I had just turned 29 when we arrived at the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. Michael Williams and I had been planning this RV trip for months. We'd rented a 32-foot Winnebago, more house than vehicle, and packed it with enough supplies for 2 weeks of wilderness exploration. Mike was my college roommate, the kind of guy who collected vintage horror movies and knew every urban legend from here to the Pacific. He'd insisted on the Bighorns because of some story he'd read about missing hikers and temporal distortions. I should have known better than to trust Mike's research. The drive from Denver took us through endless plains before the mountains rose like ancient teeth against the Wyoming sky. We'd planned to camp at the Cloud Peak Wilderness area, but a forest ranger at the entrance station, a weathered woman with eyes like chips of flint, shook her head when Mike mentioned our destination. "Wouldn't recommend Shell Falls area this time of year," she said, not looking up from our permits. "Lot of incidents lately. Folks getting turned around, coming back different." "Different how?" Mike leaned forward, practically vibrating with curiosity. She finally looked at us then, and I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Different like they forgot how to blink. Different like they can't remember their own names but somehow know yours before you say it. Different like they smell of pine and decay even after 3 showers. Mike laughed. "Sounds like my kind of vacation." The ranger didn't smile. "Take the southern route to Meadowlark Lake instead. Trust me on this." But Mike had his heart set on Shell Falls, and I was too tired from driving to argue. We thanked her and drove deeper into the mountains, the RV's engine groaning as we climbed switchback after switchback. The first sign something was wrong came with the GPS. Around mile marker 47, it started showing our location as a blue dot in the middle of nowhere. Not on any road, not even on the map. The screen flickered between satellite and road view, displaying terrain that looked like aerial shots of Mars. "Probably just poor signal," I said, but my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Look at this," Mike said, studying his phone. "According to this, we're currently driving through a lake that doesn't exist." I glanced at his screen. The map showed us as a moving dot underwater, in the middle of what the GPS labeled as Mirror Lake, a body of water our paper maps insisted had been drained in 1987. We found our campsite just as the sun began to set, a clearing beside Shell Creek, surrounded by lodgepole pines that seemed to lean inward like they were listening. The RV fit perfectly in the space, as if it had been waiting for us. Mike immediately started setting up his camp chairs and unpacking his camera equipment. He was documenting everything, planning to turn our trip into some kind of found footage experience for his YouTube channel. "This is perfect," he said, filming the creek. "The sound quality is incredible." But as I connected the RV to our portable generator, I realized what was bothering me. The sound quality was incredible because there were no other sounds. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the trees. Just the water running over rocks and our own voices echoing slightly as if we were speaking inside a vast, empty room. That first night we cooked steaks on the camp grill and drank beer while Mike regaled me with local legends. The bighorns, he explained, were considered sacred by the Crow and Cheyenne tribes, who spoke of spirits that could steal faces and memories. There were stories of trappers in the 1800s who'd returned from the mountains speaking in tongues, or not speaking at all. More recently, hikers reported time slips, losing hours or even days with no memory of where they'd been. In 1987, Mike said, warming to his subject, a family of 4 went camping near here. They found their RV 3 weeks later, perfectly clean inside like it had been sanitized. The family was never found, but locals reported seeing them for months afterward, walking the trails. Always together, always smiling, always silent. "Cheerful bedtime story," I muttered, but I was listening. The darkness beyond our campfire seemed to press closer with each tale. It was past midnight when I first heard the whispers, soft, sibilant sounds that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was almost conversational, like 2 people having an intimate discussion just out of earshot. "Mike, you hear that?" He paused, beer halfway to his lips. "Hear what?" The whispering stopped. Nothing. Must be the water. But it wasn't the water. As we sat in the darkness, the sound started again. This time, I was sure they were voices, speaking in what sounded like reversed English. Mike heard them too. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, how he kept glancing toward the tree line. "Wind in the pines," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We retreated to the RV around 1 a.m., locking the door behind us like the aluminum walls could keep out whatever was making those sounds. I fell asleep to the whispers continuing outside, rising and falling like a tide of secrets. I woke to find Mike's bunk empty and the RV door hanging open. The digital clock read 3:06 a.m. and pale moonlight streamed through the doorway. I called his name, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the mountain air sharp enough to cut. "Mike!" My voice echoed strangely, as if the mountains were throwing it back at me in slightly different tones. I followed the beam of my flashlight toward the creek, then stopped cold. Footprints, Mike's hiking boots, clearly visible in the soft earth beside the water, but they weren't walking prints. They were perfectly parallel, as if he'd been walking sideways, or sliding. The trail led upstream toward the falls. I followed it for maybe 100 yards before the prints simply stopped. Not at the water's edge, not at a rock formation. They just ended in the middle of the trail, as if Mike had been lifted straight up into the air. "Mike, this isn't funny," but the only answer was the whispers starting again, now coming from all directions. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling his name until my throat was raw. Finally, I returned to the RV to grab my phone and call for help, but I had no signal. Not even emergency service. According to the phone, I was in a dead zone that extended infinitely in all directions. I sat in the driver's seat, staring out at the darkness, trying to decide whether to drive out for help or wait for Mike to return. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. That's when I saw the light moving through the trees, a soft, yellowish glow, like a lantern or flashlight bobbing between the trunks about 50 yards away. I grabbed my own light and headed toward it, hope and fear warring in my chest. "Mike, that you?" The light stopped moving. I approached carefully, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The light I'd seen was gone, but something else was there. A structure that hadn't been visible in daylight. It looked like an old cabin, logs dark with age and moss. The windows were boarded up, but light seeped through the gaps between the boards. I should have turned around then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back to the RV and drive away, leaving Mike to whatever he'd found out here. But he was my friend, and that light might mean he'd found shelter. I approached the cabin's front door, which stood slightly ajar. The light inside was warm and inviting, and I could smell coffee brewing, bacon frying. My stomach rumbled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since dinner. "Hello," I called. "Anyone home?" "Come in," a voice answered. It sounded like Mike, but different. Slower. More deliberate. "Doors open." I pushed the door wide and stepped inside. The interior was larger than the cabin's exterior suggested. A single room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 chairs positioned around a wooden table. Mike sat in one of them, his back to me, staring into the fire. "Jesus, Mike, I've been looking everywhere for you. How did you find this place?" He didn't answer immediately. The fire crackled, and I could hear that bacon still sizzling on what looked like a cast-iron stove. "Mike?" When he turned around, I understood what the ranger had meant about people coming back different. It was Mike's face, Mike's body, Mike's clothes, but his eyes were wrong. Too wide, unblinking like he'd forgotten how eyelids worked. His smile stretched wider than human anatomy should allow, showing not just teeth, but gums, the pink wetness inside his mouth. "Hello, James," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal except for the fact that his lips didn't move when he spoke. "I've been waiting for you." I backed toward the door, but it had swung shut behind me. When I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. "Where have you been?" I managed to ask. "Here," Mike said, still smiling that impossible smile. "Always here, waiting for friends to visit." The thing wearing Mike's face stood up, and I noticed it moved wrong. Too fluid, like its joints weren't quite in the right places. It approached the stove and returned with a plate of bacon and eggs, still steaming. "You must be hungry," it said. "Traveling is tiring." The smell hit me then. Under the bacon and coffee there was something else, something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in standing water. And as I watched, tiny flies began to buzz around the edges of the plate. "I'm not hungry," I said, trying the door handle again. "Of course you are." Mike's voice had taken on a hypnotic quality, and I realized I was hungry. Starving, in fact. When had I last eaten? The bacon looked perfect, crispy around the edges but still tender in the middle. I found myself reaching for the plate before I caught myself and jerked my hand back. "What happened to you out there, Mike?" "I found what I was looking for," he said, setting the plate on the table between us. "The stories were true, James. All of them. There are things in these mountains that have been waiting a long time for visitors." "What kind of things?" His smile grew even wider. "Old things. Hungry things. Things that remember when the ice covered the world and men hadn't yet learned to walk upright." I noticed that the cabin had no windows on the interior walls. The light I'd seen from outside had been coming from this room, but there was nowhere for it to have shone through. The boards covering the windows were solid, no gaps between them. "How did you get here, Mike?" "I walked," he said simply, "just like you did, following the lights, following the whispers. They wanted us to find this place." "Who's they?" Instead of answering, he tilted his head to one side, farther than any human head should be able to turn, and listened to something I couldn't hear. "They're coming back now," he said. "They want to meet you properly." That's when I heard the footsteps on the cabin's roof. Soft, padded sounds like bare feet on wood. They moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then back again, as if something was pacing up there. "Mike, we need to get out of here." "But we just arrived," he said, and his voice was getting further away even though he hadn't moved. "And they've prepared such wonderful things for us." The footsteps above grew more numerous. It sounded like a crowd of people walking around on the roof, their movements perfectly synchronized. Then I heard them on the walls, moving down the exterior of the cabin like spiders. I threw myself at the door, pulling and pushing at the handle with both hands. Behind me, Mike began to laugh, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the night. But the landscape had changed. Where the creek and our campsite should have been, there was now a vast, open space filled with standing stones arranged in concentric circles. Each stone was tall as a person, and shapes moved between them in the moonlight. "This isn't right," I said aloud, and my voice echoed off the stones like I was in a canyon. "Nothing's right here," Mike said from behind me. When I turned, he was standing in the cabin doorway, but now I could see through him, a translucent outline of my friend filled with writhing shadow. That's what makes it interesting. The shapes between the stones were approaching. They looked like people at first glance, but their movements were wrong. Too fast, too fluid, like they were underwater. As they got closer, I could see they wore faces that didn't quite fit, expressions that shifted and changed even as I watched. I ran. Behind me, Mike called out in a voice that was no longer his. "You can't leave, James. We haven't finished our conversation." But I was already crashing through the trees, following what I hoped was the direction back to our campsite. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I kept running, guided by nothing but panic and the desperate hope that our RV was still there. I burst into the clearing just as the eastern sky began to lighten with dawn. The RV sat exactly where we'd left it, generator still humming quietly. I dove inside and locked the door, then started the engine with shaking hands. As I put the vehicle in gear, I heard tapping on the windows. Soft, polite knocking, like someone asking to be let in. I didn't look to see who it was. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning on the soft earth. Behind me, the tapping became pounding, then a sound like fingernails being dragged across metal. I kept driving, following the dirt road back toward the main highway, not caring about the damage I might be doing to the undercarriage. It wasn't until I reached the ranger station that I allowed myself to look in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I could have sworn I saw something tall and pale standing between the trees, waving goodbye. The same ranger who'd warned us was there when I stumbled into the station, babbling about missing friends and moving shadows. She listened patiently, then made some calls. A search and rescue team went out that afternoon, but they found no trace of Mike or the cabin I described. According to their report, there were no structures in the area where I claimed to have seen it. They did find something else, though. Our original campsite exactly as we'd left it, complete with Mike's camp chair and the remains of our dinner still sitting on the picnic table. But the food had rotted, the beer cans were rusted through, and everything was covered in a layer of dust and pine needles. According to the forensic team, the campsite looked like it had been abandoned for months. I drove home that day, but the trip took longer than it should have. My GPS kept glitching, showing me in impossible locations, and twice I found myself on roads that didn't appear on any map. Each time, I'd stop and check my position, only to find myself back on the highway with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The dreams started a week later. Every night I'd find myself back in that clearing with the standing stones, and Mike would be there waiting for me. He'd smile that impossible smile and ask why I'd left so early, assure me that his new friends were very interested in meeting me properly. But the worst part was when I'd wake up, because sometimes, just for a moment in that space between sleeping and waking, I could still hear the whispers, and they were coming from inside my apartment. 3 months later, I moved across the country, hoping distance would break whatever connection I'd made to that place. It helped for a while. The dreams became less frequent. The whispers faded to a barely audible murmur. Then Mike started calling me. Not my Mike, the thing that had worn his face in that impossible cabin. It would call at exactly 3:06 a.m., always from Mike's old number, and when I answered, I'd hear that glass-breaking laugh echoing across thousands of miles. "You can't stay away forever, James," it would say in Mike's voice. "We're still here, still waiting, and we've learned so much since you left." I stopped answering the phone after the 5th call, but it didn't matter. The thing calling me had started leaving voicemails, and each one was longer than the last. Hours of Mike's voice describing things that shouldn't exist, places that couldn't be real, inviting me to come back and see how much he'd changed. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of our old campsite, but taken recently. I could tell because my RV tracks were still visible in the dirt. Standing beside the creek, waving at the camera, was Mike. But it wasn't the Mike I remembered, or even the thing I'd encountered in the cabin. This version was taller, stretched out like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its smile split its face from ear to ear, and its eyes were completely white. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Mike's handwriting, "The door is still open." I've been thinking about going back. Not because I want to, but because I'm starting to understand that I don't have a choice. The whispers are getting louder, and sometimes when I look in mirrors I see shapes moving behind me that aren't there when I turn around. This morning, I woke up with dirt under my fingernails and pine needles in my hair. My GPS shows that I'm still in my apartment in Seattle, but my phone's step counter says I walked 14 miles last night. I don't remember walking anywhere. The thing that wears Mike's face calls me every night now, not just at 3:06 a.m., but at random hours. It's getting impatient, I think, more demanding. Last night it said something that made my blood freeze. "We don't need you to come back anymore, James. We know where you live." This morning, I found a set of footprints in the hallway outside my apartment. They were Mike's hiking boots, the same ones I'd followed beside Shell Creek that night. But these prints were filled with something dark and wet, and they led right up to my door. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what happened up there, what's still happening. If you receive this account and I'm nowhere to be found, don't come looking for me. And whatever you do, stay away from the Bighorn Mountains, because they're not just waiting for me anymore. They're waiting for anyone foolish enough to follow the whispers into the darkness between the trees, where things that used to be human smile too wide and invite you to stay forever. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Mike's voice echoing from somewhere far away, calling my name with that glass-breaking laugh. And I know, with the certainty that comes from standing at the edge of an abyss, that sooner or later I'm going to answer. The door is still open, just like he said, and I think I'm finally ready to walk through it. I never believed in the stories they told about Giffort Pincho Forest until what happened to me out there. My name is Michael Williams, I'm 32 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years, and we were at one of those crossroads that couples face. Not married, but living together. Not quite ready for kids, but talking about them more often. She was a graphic designer with this infectious laugh that could pull me out of any dark mood, and I was just a middle manager at a logistics company, trying to convince myself that my life had meaning beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports. The RV trip was her idea. "We need this, Mike," she'd said, curled up against me on our couch in Portland, scrolling through rental listings on her phone. "Just you and me, no cell service, no deadlines. Remember when we used to talk about seeing the real America?" I did remember. Back when we first started dating, we'd spend hours planning imaginary road trips, drawing routes on old maps, circling places with names like Devil's Punch Bowl and Crater Lake. But that was before life settled into its comfortable, suffocating routine. "Look at this one," she continued, showing me a picture of a modest Winnebago. "It's perfect for a weekend. And I found this spot in Giffort Pincho Forest that looks incredible. No RV parks, no crowds, just wilderness." I should have paid attention to the way she said "wilderness," with this strange hunger in her voice that I'd never heard before, but I was too busy watching the way the laptop light played across her face, highlighting the freckles scattered across her nose like constellations. "All right," I said, "let's do it." The rental place was in a strip mall between a payday loan shop and a store that sold nothing but phone cases. The guy who handed us the keys looked like he hadn't slept in days, with hollow eyes and hands that shook when he lit his cigarette. "Where you folks headed?" he asked, not really looking at us. "Giffort Pincho," Sarah said brightly. "About 15 miles north of the main road, near Sleeping Beauty Mountain." The man's cigarette stopped halfway to his lips. "You sure about that area?" "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged, but I caught the way his eyes flicked toward the forest visible beyond the parking lot. "Just, a lot of folks come back from that area different than they went in. If they come back at all." Sarah laughed. "Different how?" "Quieter," he said, then handed me the keys without another word. The RV was older than I'd expected, with wood grain paneling that had seen better decades and a persistent smell of pine sol that couldn't quite mask something underneath, something sweet and organic, like fruit left too long in the sun. But it ran fine, and Sarah was practically bouncing in her seat as we pulled out of the lot. "This is going to be perfect," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Just what we need." The drive took us deeper into Washington's forests than I'd ever been. The interstate gave way to state highways, which gave way to county roads, which finally gave way to a gravel track that our GPS claimed was Forest Service Road 41. The trees grew taller and closer with each mile, their branches creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, checking the GPS for the dozenth time. The little blue dot that represented us kept jumping around the screen, sometimes showing us miles from where we should be. "The coordinates match what I wrote down," Sarah said, but she sounded less certain than she had back in Portland. "It should be just ahead." The road curved around a massive Douglas fir, and suddenly we were in a clearing. It was perfect. Maybe too perfect. The trees formed a nearly perfect circle around a flat area just big enough for our RV, with a fire ring made of stones and a view of distant mountains through a gap in the canopy. But there was something off about it. Something that made me want to keep driving. "This is it!" Sarah exclaimed. "This is exactly like the pictures." I hadn't seen any pictures, but I didn't say anything. Sometimes it was easier to let Sarah have her enthusiasm than to question it. We set up camp as the sun began to set, and I had to admit it was beautiful. The air was cleaner than anything we breathed in Portland, and the silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence. That night, we cooked hot dogs over the fire and opened a bottle of wine Sarah had been saving for a special occasion. She seemed happier than she'd been in months, laughing at my terrible jokes and snuggling against me as the flames danced between us. "I love this," she said. "We should do this more often." "We should," I agreed, though part of me was already thinking about the long drive home, about the Monday morning meeting I'd have to attend, about all the ways this brief escape would fade into just another memory. We went to bed around 10, and I fell asleep to the sound of Sarah's breathing and the gentle rustling of wind through the trees. But sometime in the deep of night, I woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the woods, but the complete absence of sound that comes just before something terrible happens. No wind, no insects, no small creatures moving through the undergrowth. Even Sarah's breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and strange. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear something, anything, that would break the oppressive quiet. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Scratching. Not the random scratching of an animal, but something deliberate and rhythmic, like someone dragging their fingernails against the outside of the RV. It started near the back, by the bedroom, then moved slowly along the side wall toward the front. Sarah stirred beside me. "Mike, what's that sound?" The scratching stopped immediately. "Probably just a branch," I whispered, though there wasn't any wind to move the branches. We lay there in silence for another 10 minutes before the scratching started again, this time on the roof. Long, slow drags that made the metal creak. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "That's not a branch," she whispered. I slipped out of bed and crept to the small window above the dining table, peering through the gap in the curtains. The clearing looked exactly as it had when we'd gone to sleep, but the moonlight seemed dimmer somehow, as if something was absorbing it before it could reach the ground. The scratching moved to the other side of the RV, directly above where Sarah lay. She whimpered, pulling the covers over her head. I wanted to go outside, to confront whatever was making the noise, but my body refused to move. Some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to stay hidden, to wait for dawn, to pretend nothing was happening. The sounds continued for another hour before finally stopping. When I woke the next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a dream, the kind of anxiety-fueled nightmare that comes from sleeping in unfamiliar places. But when I went outside to start the coffee, I found long scratches gouged into the metal roof of the RV, too deep and too deliberate to have been made by any animal I knew. Vandals, maybe, Sarah suggested when I showed her, but her voice was shaky. Or maybe we parked under a dead branch. Neither of us believed it, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge what we were both thinking, that something had deliberately marked our RV, like a predator marking its territory. We spent the day hiking, trying to recapture the enthusiasm of the night before. The forest was beautiful in daylight, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy and creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that didn't match the swaying of branches, or a flash of something pale between the trees. When I turned to look, there was never anything there. "You're being paranoid," Sarah said when I mentioned it. "It's just the forest. Everything looks different out here." She was right, of course. I'd spent so many years in the city that my brain was struggling to process all the natural movement and shadow play of the woods. But that didn't explain why my skin crawled every time we rounded a bend in the trail, or why the birds went silent whenever we approached. We found a small stream about a mile from our camp and stopped for lunch. Sarah waded into the shallow water, laughing as the cold current swirled around her ankles. For a moment, everything felt normal again. This was the woman I'd fallen in love with. Spontaneous, joyful, unafraid of getting her feet wet. "Come in," she called. "It's freezing, but it feels amazing." I was about to join her when I noticed something in the water upstream. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log, but as I looked closer, I realized it was too white, too symmetrical. When the current shifted and I got a clearer view, my stomach lurched. It was bones. A lot of bones, picked clean and scattered across the stream bed like some grotesque game of pickup sticks. "Sarah, get out of the water." "What? Why?" "Just get out, now." She heard the urgency in my voice and waded back to shore, looking at me with concern. "What's wrong?" I pointed upstream. "Look." She followed my gaze and went very still. The bones were clearly visible now, white and weathered, too many and too large to be from any animal I could think of. "We should go back," I said, but Sarah was already walking upstream, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at car accidents. "Mike, look at this." She was standing at the edge of what I now realized was a boneyard, dozens of skeletons scattered through the shallow water and up onto the banks. Most were animals, I thought, but some of the skulls looked disturbingly human in their size and shape. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." This time, Sarah didn't argue. We packed up our lunch and hurried back toward camp, but somehow the trail looked different. Trees I was sure we'd passed on the way in seemed to be in the wrong places, and the path kept branching in ways I didn't remember. "Are we going the right way?" Sarah asked after we'd been walking for what felt like hours. I checked the GPS on my phone, but the screen just showed a blue dot floating in an expanse of green with no roads or landmarks visible. According to the device, we were somewhere in the middle of an unmapped wilderness, miles from where we'd started. "This is impossible," I muttered, trying to get a better signal by holding the phone above my head. "We've been walking on the same trail the whole time." But even as I said it, I realized it wasn't true. The trail had changed, become narrower and more overgrown, winding through sections of forest I didn't recognize. The trees were older here, massive and gnarled, with bark that looked almost like skin in the dappled light. We kept walking as the shadows grew longer, hoping to stumble across something familiar. But as evening approached, we had to face the truth. We were lost. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing through the trees. "I see light." She was right. A warm, flickering glow was visible through the forest ahead of us, like the light from a campfire or lantern. We pushed through the undergrowth toward it, branches catching at our clothes and hair. The light was coming from our own campsite. Somehow, impossibly, we'd walked in a huge circle and ended up exactly where we'd started. Our RV sat in the clearing exactly as we'd left it. The solar-powered lantern we'd hung from the awning, casting the same welcoming glow we'd seen through the trees. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "I thought we were going to have to spend the night in the woods." But I was staring at something else. The fire ring, which had been cold and empty when we left that morning, now held a crackling fire. Fresh wood was stacked neatly beside it, and I could smell meat cooking. "Did you start a fire before we left?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Sarah's face went pale. "No. Mike, someone's been here." We approached the camp cautiously, but there was no sign of anyone else. The fire burned merrily, and a pot of what looked like stew bubbled over the flames, but the clearing was empty, except for us. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space, seeming to bounce off the trees and come back distorted. But there was no answer. "We should leave," Sarah whispered. "Right now. Pack up and drive back to town." I wanted to agree, but as I looked around the clearing, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The scratches on the RV roof were gone. Not painted over or repaired, simply absent, as if they'd never existed at all. "The scratches," I said. "What?" I pointed to the roof. "The scratches from last night. They're gone." Sarah stared up at the unmarked metal, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't identify. "Maybe we imagined them," she said finally. "Maybe we were both just spooked and—" "We didn't imagine them," I said firmly. "Someone or something has been in our camp." But even as I said it, I could feel doubt creeping in. The scratches had been so clear that morning, deep gouges that would have required real force to create. How could they just disappear? The stew smelled incredible, rich and savory with herbs I couldn't identify. Despite everything, my stomach rumbled. We'd been hiking all day, and the sandwiches we'd packed for lunch felt like a distant memory. "We can't eat that," Sarah said, reading my thoughts. "We don't know where it came from." She was right, of course, but the smell was intoxicating, and after a day of fear and confusion, the fire felt like a beacon of warmth and normalcy. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving closer to the flames. "Just for tonight," I said. "We'll eat, get some rest, and leave first thing in the morning. If someone wanted to hurt us, they wouldn't have cooked us dinner." It was a rationalization, and we both knew it. But we were hungry and tired and lost, and the alternative was facing the dark forest with empty stomachs and frayed nerves. The stew was the best thing I'd ever tasted. The meat was tender and flavorful, with a richness that seemed to spread through my entire body with each bite. Sarah was more cautious at first, taking small spoonfuls and chewing slowly, but soon she was eating with the same enthusiasm I was. "This is incredible," she said between bites. "What do you think it is? Venison, maybe? Or elk?" I took another large spoonful. "Whoever made this knows what they're doing." We ate until the pot was empty, then sat by the fire in comfortable silence. The warmth and food had done wonders for our mood, and the events of the day began to feel like products of our urban paranoia rather than genuine threats. "Maybe we overreacted," Sarah said, voicing what we were both thinking. "Maybe there's a reasonable explanation for everything." "Maybe," I agreed, though I couldn't think of what that explanation might be. We went to bed earlier than the previous night, both of us exhausted from the day's hiking and stress. But, again, I woke in the deep darkness to the sound of scratching. This time, it wasn't just on the roof. The sounds were coming from all around the RV, long, deliberate scrapes against the metal walls, as if multiple somethings were slowly circling our temporary home. Sarah was awake too, her hand finding mine in the darkness. "It's happening again," she whispered. The scratching grew louder and more frenzied, accompanied now by a low humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Through the thin walls of the RV, I could hear footsteps. Not the random padding of animals, but the measured pace of something walking upright. A shadow passed in front of the window above our bed, briefly blocking out what little starlight filtered through the curtains. Then another shadow, and another, until it seemed like dozens of figures were moving around the RV in a slow, ritualistic dance. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered. But before I could answer, the sounds stopped. Not gradually, like the night before, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The shadows disappeared, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us lifted. In the sudden silence, I heard Sarah's breathing change. It became deeper, more rhythmic, with a slight wheeze that I'd never noticed before. I turned to look at her, but in the darkness I could only make out the vague outline of her shape under the covers. "Sarah, are you okay?" She didn't answer, but I felt her shift beside me, rolling over to face away from me. Her breathing continued its strange new pattern, and there was a smell now, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and Sarah was shaking me awake. "Mike, wake up. We need to leave. Now." I sat up, instantly alert. Sarah was already dressed, her hair pulled back in a ponytail and her backpack slung over her shoulder. But something was wrong with her face. Her skin looked pale and waxy, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I had dreams all night," she said, but her voice sounded different somehow, flatter, less animated than usual. "Terrible dreams. We need to get out of this place." I couldn't argue with that. While Sarah packed up our gear, I went outside to check the RV for damage. The scratches were back, deeper and more extensive than before. They covered every surface, the roof, the sides, even the windows, in a pattern that looked almost like writing in some unknown language. But what bothered me more was the circle of dead grass around the RV. Where there had been healthy vegetation the day before, there was now a perfect ring of blackened earth, as if something had poisoned the ground itself. "Sarah, look at this." But when I turned around, she was gone. The RV was empty, her backpack abandoned on the floor, the door standing open like a mouth. "Sarah," I called, "where are you?" My voice echoed through the forest, but there was no answer. I circled the RV, calling her name, but found no sign of where she might have gone. It was as if she'd simply vanished. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, following what might have been footprints in the soft earth around the clearing. The tracks led into the forest, but they seemed to change as I followed them, becoming less human and more something else. By noon, I was forced to admit that I wasn't going to find her on my own. I needed help. Park rangers, search and rescue teams, people who knew these woods better than I did. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. The lights worked, the radio crackled with static, but the engine was completely dead. I popped the hood and stared at the maze of wires and components, looking for something obvious like a disconnected battery cable. Everything looked normal, but I'm not much of a mechanic. For all I knew, someone could have sabotaged the engine and I'd never be able to tell. With no other choice, I grabbed my backpack and started hiking toward what I hoped was the main road. The GPS on my phone was still useless, showing only that blue dot floating in green nothingness, but I figured if I kept walking in one direction long enough, I'd have to hit something eventually. The forest seemed different during the day. The trees were still massive and ancient, but now they felt watchful rather than merely imposing. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Not the random flickers I'd noticed before, but deliberate, purposeful motion that stopped the moment I turned to look. After what felt like hours of walking, I heard the sound of running water. Following the sound, I found the same stream where we discovered the bones the day before. But now, the water ran clear, and there was no sign of the boneyard we'd found upstream. I knelt by the water's edge, cupping the cold liquid in my hands to drink. My reflection wavered in the current, distorted by the ripples, but clear enough for me to see my own haggard face staring back at me. That's when I noticed the second reflection. Someone was standing behind me, close enough that I should have heard them approach. I spun around, expecting to find another hiker, or maybe a park ranger, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the water, both reflections were gone. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" The forest was silent except for the babbling of the stream, but now I could smell something on the wind. That same sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed in the RV the night before, like fruit left too long in the sun. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to a road, or at least to other people. But as I walked, the smell grew stronger, and I began to hear something else. A voice, faint and distorted, calling my name. "Mike." It was Sarah's voice, but wrong somehow. Too high, too breathy, as if someone was doing a poor impersonation of her. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees and rocks until I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. "Sarah," I called back. "Where are you?" "Mike, help me." The voice was clearer now, definitely coming from up ahead. I broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth toward the sound. Branches caught at my clothes and scratched my face, but I didn't care. Sarah was alive, and she needed help. I burst through a screen of low-hanging branches and found myself in another clearing. This one was smaller than our campsite, more like a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering evergreens. And there, in the center of the space, was Sarah. She was sitting with her back to me, her long brown hair falling over her shoulders exactly as it had that morning. But something about her posture was wrong. Too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin arranged by someone who'd never seen a real person sit down. "Sarah, thank God, I've been looking everywhere for you." She didn't turn around or acknowledge me in any way. As I got closer, I could see that she was perfectly still, not even breathing that I could detect. "Sarah?" I reached out to touch her shoulder, and she finally moved. But instead of turning to face me, she tilted her head back at an impossible angle, rotating it a full 180 degrees until she was looking at me upside down. Her face was Sarah's, but wrong in every possible way. Her skin was the color of old parchment, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only the whites, and her mouth hung open in a perfect circle. When she spoke, her voice came from somewhere deep in her chest, a wet, bubbling sound that barely resembled human speech. "Mike, I've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my rational mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be Sarah. This was some kind of sick joke, a hallucination brought on by stress and dehydration. But the thing wearing Sarah's face smiled at me, and I saw that her teeth had been filed to points. "Don't you want to stay with me?" she asked, her voice becoming more normal, more recognizably Sarah's with each word. "We could be together forever. All you have to do is come a little closer." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I found myself taking a step forward instead. There was something hypnotic about her voice, something that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to some deeper, more primitive part of my brain. "That's it," she cooed. "Just a little closer." I took another step, then another. Her upside-down face was only a few feet away now, and I could see that the dark veins under her skin were moving, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat I knew. Her tongue darted out to lick her lips, and I saw that it was too long and too thin, more like a snake's tongue than a human one. The sight of it broke whatever spell she'd been weaving over me, and I stumbled backward. "No," I said. "You're not Sarah. What are you? What did you do to her?" The thing's smile widened, stretching her face in ways that should have torn the skin. "I am Sarah," she said. "I'm everything Sarah ever was, and everything she ever could be. Don't you love me anymore?" "Where is she?" I demanded. "What happened to the real Sarah?" "I told you," the creature said, and now its voice was becoming less human with each word, taking on a wet, chittering quality. "I am Sarah. She invited me in, Mike. She welcomed me with open arms." The thing that looked like Sarah began to stand, but its movements were all wrong. Joints bending in directions they shouldn't, limbs extending far beyond their normal length. As it rose to its full height, I could see that it was much taller than Sarah had ever been, at least 7 feet, with arms that hung down almost to the ground. "She tasted so sweet," it continued, its voice now a barely recognizable whisper. "All that love, all that hope, all those dreams you shared. I consumed every bit of it, and now I know everything she knew. I know how much you loved her laugh. I know about the first time you told her you loved her. I know about the ring you've been hiding in your sock drawer." It laughed then, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the buzzing of insects. "Did you think she didn't know? She's been waiting for you to propose for months. But now you'll never have to worry about that. We can be together forever, just like she wanted." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing through the forest in pursuit, but its movements were clumsy and loud, as if it wasn't used to its stolen body. I had a head start, and I knew that my only chance was to reach the RV before it caught me. The forest blurred past me as I ran, branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me with every step. But somehow I found my way back to the clearing where we'd made camp, driven by pure instinct and desperation. The RV was exactly as I'd left it, scratched and surrounded by dead grass, but it had never looked more like salvation. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. The engine turned over on the first try. I didn't question the miracle, just threw the RV into gear and drove toward what I hoped was the main road. Behind me, I could hear something screaming in the forest, a sound like an animal in pain, but with an underlying note of pure rage that made my skin crawl. I drove for what felt like hours, following what might have been a road through the endless forest. The GPS was still useless, but I kept the vehicle pointed in what seemed like a generally downward direction, hoping that gravity would eventually lead me to civilization. When I finally saw the lights of a gas station through the trees, I nearly wept with relief. I pulled up to the pumps and sat there for several minutes, just breathing and trying to convince myself that I was really safe. The attendant who came out to help me was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell her everything, but I knew how it would sound. Instead, I just said, "My girlfriend is missing. I need to call the police." The search lasted 3 days. Park rangers and volunteers combed the forest around our campsite, following every trail and checking every stream. They found the clearing where we'd camped, though they said it looked like it had been empty for years. They found the stream, but no bones. They even found the smaller clearing where I'd encountered the thing that looked like Sarah, but there was no evidence that anyone had ever been there. They never found Sarah. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead, likely the victim of a bear attack or some other wilderness accident. Her body was never recovered, which the rangers said wasn't uncommon in such dense forest. "Animals scavenge," they explained. "Evidence gets scattered." I tried to tell them what I'd really seen, but I could see in their eyes that they thought I was suffering from some kind of breakdown brought on by trauma and exposure. Maybe they were right. Maybe the thing in the clearing had been a hallucination, a product of stress and fear and too much time alone in the woods. But I don't think so, because sometimes, late at night, I still hear scratching at my windows. And sometimes, when I'm walking down the street or sitting in a restaurant, I catch a glimpse of brown hair and hear a laugh that sounds almost like Sarah's. Almost, but not quite. The ring I'd hidden in my sock drawer is still there, waiting for a proposal that will never come. I think about getting rid of it sometimes, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's all I have left of the woman I loved, of the life we might have had together. The doctors say I'm making good progress. They've given me medications to help with the nightmares and therapy to process the trauma. They assure me that in time the memories will fade, the fear will diminish, and I'll be able to move on with my life. But they don't understand. The thing I met in the forest wasn't just wearing Sarah's face. It knew everything about her, every memory we'd shared, every private moment between us. It had consumed her so completely that it could perfectly mimic her voice, her mannerisms, her deepest thoughts and feelings. And if it could do that to Sarah, what's to stop it from doing the same to others? What's to stop it from walking out of those woods, wearing someone else's face, someone else's life? I've thought about going back, about trying to find it and somehow make it pay for what it did, but I know that's exactly what it wants. It's still out there, waiting in the forest, hungry for the next person who wanders too far from the safety of civilization. So I stay in the city now, surrounded by lights and noise and the constant presence of other people. I tell myself I'm safe here, that whatever lives in Giffort Pincho Forest can't reach me in my apartment with its locks and security cameras. But late at night, when the scratching starts at my windows, I'm not so sure. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really escaped those woods at all. Sometimes I wonder if the thing that took Sarah is still playing with me, letting me think I'm safe while it decides what form my final torment will take. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if the real Michael Williams died in that forest, and I'm just another one of its hungry ghosts, telling stories to anyone who'll listen about a love that was consumed by something ancient and patient and endlessly, impossibly hungry. The scratching is getting louder now. It's almost time for me to find out which version of the truth I've been living in. I just hope that when the end comes, it's quick. And I hope Sarah forgives me for not saving her. The thing is, I keep thinking about that stew we ate on our second night. How it was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. How it filled me with such warmth and satisfaction. How Sarah ate it too, with the same enthusiasm, the same appreciation. I keep thinking about the bones we found in the stream, picked clean and scattered like discarded toys. And I keep thinking about how the thing that wore her face said she had invited it in, welcomed it with open arms. What if the stew was Sarah? What if we ate her, unknowing, and that's how it got inside both of us? What if I'm not the one who escaped at all? What if I'm the thing that's been telling this story, wearing Michael Williams like a suit of skin, practicing his memories and his voice until I could pass for him even to myself? The scratching at my windows might not be something trying to get in. It might be something trying to get out. I look at my hands in the lamplight, studying the lines and scars that I remember getting over 32 years of life. Michael's life, my life. The distinction is getting harder to make. The woman at the gas station said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Maybe she was right. Maybe I am the ghost.